Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today, we're checking out Nvidia's new GeForce RTX 3050. Now, this is the latest addition to their Ampere lineup, and although it's now the most low-end 30 series GeForce GPU on offer, it's not based on a new piece of silicon, so it's not some tiny little die. Rather, it's another G0106 product, and that means it shares the same silicon as the RTX 3060, but with the MSRP dropped down from $330 to just $250. So you can expect quite a lot of the die to be disabled to justify that cut in price. But before we get to any of that, today's video sponsor is Thermal Grizzly and their Cryonaut Extreme, which is now available in a 2-gram syringe. This high-performance thermal paste delivers maximum thermal conductivity thanks to an extremely small particle size and layer thickness. It's also very flexible, capable of standing up to sub-zero temperatures for extreme overclocking, but also performs exceptionally well for air and water cooling applications. So if your CPU or GPU needs repasting, then I suggest checking out the Thermal Grizzly range. Link is in the video description. Okay, so the core configuration has been reduced from 3,584 cores to just 2,560, so an almost 30% reduction there. But interestingly, the same 48 ROPs remain. Although the core boost frequency remains the same at 1777 MHz, the memory speed has been slightly reduced from 15 gigabits per second to 14 gigabits per second. So couple that with the smaller 128-bit wide memory bus, and we end up with a pretty significant 38% drop in memory bandwidth. An advantage of these cut downs though is a 24% drop in board power to just 130 watts. Meaning a basic 550 watt power supply will be more than sufficient to power an RTX 3050 gaming system. Now, when compared to the Radeon RX 6500 XT, the MSRP for the RTX 3050 is 25% higher at $250 US, but of course we expect that it will retail for much more than that, and we'll look into that towards the end of the video. So, although the RTX 3050 is set to cost more, it is a significantly better product on paper, packing 8GB of VRAM, PCIe x8 bandwidth, 4 display ports, AV1 decoding, and an actual hardware encoding engine. So all of the stuff you'd really expect to see on a modern graphics card, but don't actually get with the 6500 XT. Now, although Nvidia has cut the full PCIe bandwidth in half, which we never like to see on products priced at or above $200, but with 8GB of VRAM and 8 times bandwidth, the PCIe 3.0 performance will be the same as 4.0 in today's games. So the RTX 3050 isn't crippled like the 6500 XT on a PCIe 3.0 system. So, with that out of the way, let's talk about the test system specs and then jump into the benchmark results. For testing, I'm using our Ryzen 9 5950X GPU test system. And yeah, I know no one is going to pair a budget graphics card with this kind of CPU, but that's not the point. We're testing GPU performance here, and therefore we wish to avoid introducing a CPU bottleneck, which would skew the data. As for the data itself, everything is 100% fresh for this video. I've spent the last few weeks updating our mid-range GPU results for the 6500 XT and RTX 3050 reviews, and much of the testing has been done using dialed down quality settings, which were felt out using the 4GB 5500 XT. Finally, testing takes place at 1080p and 1440p, so let's get to it. Starting with Assassin's Creed Valhalla using the medium quality preset at 1080p, we find that the RTX 3050 is good for 79 FPS on average, so here it's basically a GTX 1660 Super, and that made it 18% faster than the 6500 XT using PCIe 4.0, and then 30% faster when compared to the 3.0 configuration. It was also only 8% slower than the RTX 2060, so I think a decent result there overall. The 1440p data is much more favourable for the RTX 3050 when compared to AMD's recently released 6500 XT. Again, the 3050 is mimicking the performance of the 1660 Super, but that meant here it was 38% faster than the 6500 XT, or 45% faster when limiting the Radeon GPU to PCIe 3.0. Shadow of the Tomb Raider was tested using the highest quality preset, as it is quite an old game now, and the measuring stick for this testing, as I said earlier, was the 4GB 5500 XT, which was good for over 60 FPS on average under these conditions, so that seemed reasonable to me. The RTX 3050 blasted past that result though with 87 FPS on average, edging it slightly ahead of the 1660 Super this time. That made it 34% faster than the 6500 XT or 85% faster when limiting the 6500 XT to PCIe 3.0. So super easy win here for Nvidia. And again, the situation worsens for the 6500 XT at 1440p, and now even with PCI Express 4.0, we can't achieve a 40 FPS average. Meanwhile, the RTX 3050 fell just shy of 60 FPS and was again seen matching the 1660 Super. The Watch Dogs Legion results were quite good for the Radeon RX 6500 XT when using the medium quality preset, but here the RTX 3050 was good for 88 FPS, and that did make it 17% faster than the 6500 XT, or 28% faster when comparing the PCIe 3.0 result. So admittedly, that is a big win for Nvidia. When compared to the 1660 Super, it was just 5% faster and then 15% slower than the 5600 XT and RTX 2060. So a little disappointing there when compared to those older models. Again though, the RTX 3050 does race away with it at 1440p, averaging just over 60 FPS to make it 28% faster than the 6500 XT, or 36% faster when using PCIe 3.0 for the Radeon GPU. It was also 10% faster than the 1660 Super, but 14 to 15% slower than the RTX 2060 and 5600 XT. Now, for testing Rainbow Six Siege, we're using the ultra quality preset with the HD texture pack enabled, because again, the 5500 XT, the 4GB version, was used to establish the test settings, and it was good for well over 100 FPS at all times, averaging 145 FPS. The RTX 3050 had no issues crushing that result though, with 225 FPS on average, making it just 11% slower than the RTX 2060 and 14% faster than the 1660 Super. Unbelievably, it was 92% faster than the 6500 XT, and let's not even bother with the PCIe 3.0 result for that GPU. Moving to 1440p sees the RTX 3050 beat the 6500 XT by an embarrassing 110% margin, as it was again able to slot in between the 1660 Super and RTX 2060. Hell, it was only 10% slower than the RX 6600. For whatever reason, the 6500 XT was even worse than expected in F1 2021, and I suspect the issue is PCI Express bandwidth. But whatever the case, the RTX 3050 was 52% faster at 1080p using the second highest quality preset with 141 FPS on average. And then PCIe 3.0 completely crippled the 6500 XT, and now the RTX 3050 is seen to be 114% faster. And I should note that I got the exact same result using PCIe 3.0 with the 3050. Moving to 1440p again increases the margin in favor of the 3050, which is now 66% faster than the 6500 XT when using PCIe 4.0 and 128% faster than the PCIe 3.0 configuration. We're also looking at slightly better performance than the GTX 1660 Super. Next, we have Horizon Zero Dawn, and here the 6500 XT using PCIe 4.0 did very well relative to most other games with 72 FPS on average. And that meant that the RTX 3050 was just 14% faster, though with both using PCI Express 3.0, the GeForce GPU would be a massive 55% faster. And as you'd expect, the margins did open up at 1440p, and now the RTX 3050 is 24% faster than the 6500 XT. It was also a few frames faster than the 1660 Super, and trailed the RTX 2060 by a 15% margin. Moving on to Far Cry 6, we find an average of 96 FPS when using the GeForce RTX 3050 at 1080p with the medium quality preset. So as we've seen multiple times already, it is basically delivering 1660 Super performance, though it wasn't a great deal slower than the RTX 2060 in this one, at least when comparing the average frame rate. Meanwhile, the 6500 XT also turns in one of its better performances in Far Cry 6, and as a result the 3050 was just 14% faster. Though again, the issue with the 6500 XT is PCI Express 3.0, and when compared to that configuration, the 3050 was 37% faster. The 6500 XT does crumble at 1440p, where the RTX 3050 remains quite strong, turning in over 60 FPS on average to make it 42% faster. Doom Eternal was a really rough title for the 6500 XT, and this was especially true when using PCIe 3.0. The RTX 3050, on the other hand, it does extremely well here, matching the RTX 2060 with 178 FPS on average, and that meant it was 82% faster than the 6500 XT, and 287% faster than the PCIe 3.0 configuration. So that's really quite something. And it's really probably all we need to say about that. 1440p is, as you'd expect, an ugly affair for the 6500 XT, and it's disappointing to see that the 4GB RX 570 could hit 60 FPS for what was a very playable experience. The 6500 XT, though, using PCIe 3.0 was reduced to just 36 FPS. The RTX 3050 had no such issues though, pumping out a super impressive 130 FPS while keeping 1% lows above 100 FPS. It was also 13% faster than the RTX 2060 and just 11% slower than the RX 6600, so a fairly stellar result there. Resident Evil Village isn't a very demanding game, especially with the balance quality preset, so it's no surprise that at 1080p, the RTX 3050 is comfortably pushing over 100 FPS, averaging 114 FPS. Again, this is very GTX 1660 Super-like performance, and it meant that the new GeForce GPU was 52% faster than the 6500 XT, or 78% faster if we compare the PCIe 3.0 configuration. Next up, we have Death Stranding, and this is another game that isn't terribly demanding, despite looking quite good overall. The GTX 3050 was good for 108 FPS on average, using the default quality preset at 1080p, and that placed it directly between the 1660 Super and RTX 2060, so a great result there. It was also 24% faster than the 6500 XT, and dropping the Radeon graphics card down to PCIe 3.0 only extended that margin to 27%. So you could certainly argue that this is a good result for the Radeon GPU. Even at 1440p, the 6500 XT hangs in there, averaging 64 FPS to the RTX 3050's 79 FPS, which only made the GeForce GPU 23% faster. And given the difference in price, even at MSRP, that's a good result for AMD. The RTX 3050 rendered 112 FPS on average in Hitman 3 using the medium quality preset at 1080p, and that again placed it very close to the RTX 2060. In fact, it was just 3% slower than the 2060, while it beat the 1660 Super by a 23% margin. It was also 29% faster than the 6500 XT, or 42% faster when restricted to PCIe 3.0. Even at 1440p, the RTX 3050 still managed well over 60 FPS, and that made it 9% faster than the RTX 2060 and 35% faster than the 6500 XT. So a great result here given the current market. Last up, we have Cyberpunk 2077, and here the RTX 3050 managed to break the 60 FPS barrier with the medium quality preset, averaging 60 FPS, which, all things considered, is actually quite a good result. Unfortunately, it was 18% slower than the RTX 2060, but it was also 40% faster than the 6500 XT, or 69% faster when using PCIe 3.0. Those margins remained much the same at 1440p. Here the RTX 3050 was 37% faster than the 6500 XT, or 58% faster when using PCIe 3.0. It did only manage 41 FPS on average, so for this game I'd say the 3050 is better suited for 1080p gameplay. Like the Radeon RX 6500 XT, the GeForce RTX 3050 is very light on power, pushing total system usage just 277 watts in our Doom benchmark. So given the resulting performance, that makes it much more efficient than the 6500 XT, but even if we take a more favourable game such as Death Stranding or maybe even Hitman 3, the 3050 still stacks up well as it only increased total system usage over the 6500 XT by 15%. Now, although I mentioned earlier that the RTX 3050 delivers the exact same level of performance using either PCIe 3.0 or 4.0, here's a quick example of this. Please note I did test all 12 games and found nothing outside of the margin of error, though most results were exactly the same. Whereas the 6500 XT dropped performance by 13% with PCIe 3.0, we see absolutely no change for the RTX 3050. So that means for gamers limited to PCIe 3.0, the RTX 3050 is going to be significantly faster than the 6500 XT. And here's a look at the 12-game average data, which has been calculated using the GeoMean. The RTX 3050 averaged 108 FPS at 1080p, and this meant that it was just 5% faster than the 1660 Super, 10% slower than the RTX 2060, and 23% slower than the RX 6600. When compared to the 6500 XT though, we're looking at a 37% performance boost, or a massive 74% increase when compared to the PCIe 3.0 result. As we often saw, the 1440p data is even more brutal for the 6500 XT, as here the RTX 3050 was 54% faster, or 85% faster when comparing the PCIe 3.0 performance. The 3050 also averaged 74 FPS, so more often than not, it's going to be good for over 60 FPS at 1440p using respectable quality settings. Okay, so what about ray tracing performance? Personally, I don't feel as though the RTX 3050's rasterization performance is nearly powerful enough to justify turning on ray tracing, but you can, and some of you might want to, so let's take a look at that. Starting with Watch Dogs Legion, we see that stock the RTX 3050 was good for 88 FPS on average with the dialed down medium quality preset. Enabling DLSS without enabling RTFX is really quite a big help here, boosting the average frame rate by 26% to 111 FPS, and we're now looking at RX 6600 Lite performance. Turning on ray tracing with the medium quality settings plus DLSS dropped the average frame rate to 60 FPS, so still very playable, but personally I'd rather play the game with a higher quality preset and perhaps leave DLSS enabled. Anyway, the game was still playable with ray tracing enabled plus DLSS, delivering around 60 FPS on average. Without the aid of DLSS though, frame rates dropped into the low 40s, and that's about the same level of ray tracing performance you can expect from the RX 6600 in this title. Testing with Far Cry 6, which doesn't support DLSS, sees the RTX 3050 still able to comfortably break the 60 FPS barrier with ray tracing fully enabled. It was slower than the much more expensive RX 6600, but whereas it was 28% slower without RT enabled, it was just 14% slower with it enabled. Finally, we have Cyberpunk 2077, and again we find that DLSS is the most impressive feature here, boosting rasterization performance by an incredible 48%, allowing the 3050 to beat the RX 6600. Then, using ray tracing without DLSS enabled, saw the RTX 3050 and RX 6600 both delivering comparable performance with between 30 to 40 FPS. But of course, enabling DLSS offered a big performance boost here, and now the 3050 was good for around 60 FPS on average. Finally, for those of you wondering why I compared with the RX 6600 and not the 6500 XT for ray tracing benchmarks, it's because I'm just not that cruel. Seriously though, the 6500 XT is so weak with ray tracing enabled that the data isn't even useful for comparison. Okay, time for the all-important cost per frame analysis, and I'm going to start with the MSRP, using the 1080p data. But I will include the 1440p results for the more realistic real-world pricing comparison, which I'll make in a moment. But let's get the Fantasyland stuff out of the way first. If the RTX 3050 was to sell for the $250 US MSRP, which it obviously won't, but if it did, it would smoke the $200 6500 XT, offering a discount of 9% per frame or 28% when comparing the PCIe 3.0 data. That said, it would also be much worse value than the GTX 1650 Super and slightly worse than the RX 6500 XT, but that's to be expected given the current market. So we can accept a little bit of stagnation here, though we still don't like it. Now, if we look at real-world pricing, the situation is quite different. For the used GPUs, we're taking the average sale price seen over at eBay.com for the past 4 weeks, and for new GPUs, the pricing is based on what we could find in stock at places like Newegg.com. This places the 6500 XT at $270 US, but we're expecting the RTX 3050 to cost at least $450 US, so please take note that that is an educated guess at this point in time, given the cards aren't yet on sale. So with the 6500 XT currently selling for at least 35% over the MSRP, we're expecting that the RTX 3050 will come in at a much larger 80% premium, but hopefully it is less than that. Still, even at $450, the RTX 3050 is better value for PCIe 3.0 owners as it reduces the cost per frame by 4%, while also including a number of important features. That said, if you have PCIe 4.0 and don't require any of the missing features of the 6500 XT and are willing to sacrifice some visual quality in order to achieve acceptable performance, you could argue that the 6500 XT is better value at $270 US, as it was 18% cheaper per frame than the RTX 3050, but for me that's a serious stretch given everything else you get with the GeForce GPU. Also, if you're targeting entry-level 1440p gaming, the RTX 3050 is without question the superior product, vastly superior in my opinion. Not only are you likely to be pushing well over 60 FPS with the GeForce GPU, but it was also just 8% more expensive per frame when compared to the 6500 XT in the PCIe 4.0 mode. So for those of you gaming at 1440p, even if priced at $450 US, the RTX 3050 is a much better value product and well worth spending the extra money on or saving up for. That said, it's also well worth keeping in mind that at this price point, the RX 6600 is technically better value as it costs just 24% more, but offers 26% more performance. Granted, they are about the same in terms of value, but when spending this much, the RX 6600 does become a viable alternative. Okay, so while we fear that the RTX 3050 will likely end up around $450 US or possibly more, and we've seen that even there it's generally better value than the 6500 XT, what price does it need to be before no one can argue that the 6500 XT has any value? I believe that figure is around $370 US, which is likely wishful thinking, but if Nvidia pulled that off, it would be extremely embarrassing for AMD. At $370, the 3050 would be on par with the 6500 XT using PCIe 4.0 in terms of cost per frame using our 1080p data, while offering twice as much VRAM, twice as much PCIe bandwidth, better decoding support, actual encoding support, and more than 2 display outputs. So I really can't see the 3050 being that competitive on pricing, but anywhere between $370 and $450 is going to be rough for the 6500 XT. So how desirable the GeForce RTX 3050 ends up being will depend entirely on pricing and availability. If it ends up costing $500 US, then it's going to be a big old fat nothing burger in my opinion, and you might as well just get the faster Radeon RX 6600. So it is really difficult to say just how excited you should get about the RTX 3050, but based on the performance just seen, we know exactly where it should be priced in order to make sense. But making sense isn't really something the GPU market seems to do anymore. Now, we expected the 6500 XT to come in at around $300 US, where we believed it would suck, and it did slightly better, hitting $270 US, at least for now, but still ultimately sucks at that price despite being the cheapest new graphics card you can get your hands on. We recommend you either continue to hold out or buy secondhand, and frankly the RX 570 4GB for $220 used is a significantly better compromise and hands down the best option for those of you still using a PCIe 3.0 system, which again we suspect is the vast majority of you. Now, as for the RTX 3050, we're expecting that part to come in for at least $450 US, but with the RTX 3060 selling on average for a 112% premium over MSRP, anything's possible. As noted earlier, we strongly believe that the 3050 needs to be priced at around $370 to be a great deal in the current market, and really the go-to option for PC gamers. At that price, it would be unbeatable, even when looking at the second-hand market, which sees the similarly performing 1660 Super going for $470 US. So again, based on that, the unfortunate reality is that the 3050 is probably going to cost more like $500 US. If that's the case, then you're really best off being upsold to the RX 6600, or perhaps the smarter option would be to look for a cheaper second-hand option just to tie you over. Having said all of that though, I do feel as though the RTX 3050 at $500 is a much better investment than the 6500 XT at $270, despite the fact that we don't recommend you purchase either of them at those prices. And the reason for this is quite simple. The RTX 3050 will typically offer more value to PCIe 3.0 users, which right now, as I said, is most gamers, and then you have all the extra features on top of that that I've already spoken of. And another consideration is one that a lot of the 6500 XT apologists have overlooked, and that's future-proofing, a point that we generally make fun of as it's often heavily overused or done so with an unreasonable time frame. For example, FX processors would be better than Sandy Bridge in 10 years' time. But I'm not talking about 10 years, or 5, or even 3. Rather, I fully expect that within the next 2 years, we're going to come across games that the 6500 XT is really going to struggle to play, even with the lowest quality settings, and I expect that older 4GB graphics cards like the GTX 1650 Super or 5500 XT will work just fine, while the RX 6600 and RTX 3050 will still be very capable. So how much value do you place on longevity? The ability to buy a graphics card now and still have it delivering respectable performance in 2 years' time. This is what made the RX 580 so great, and I believe it's what will make the 6500 XT even worse than what most reviewers have reported to date, and that's certainly saying something. Anyway, for now we're just going to have to wait and see where the RTX 3050 lands in terms of pricing and availability, that they sort of go hand in hand. Tim and I are also getting together shortly to do an updated video looking at the 6500 XT and RTX 3050, kind of a discussion, opinion piece type deal. We'll talk about pricing there, other reviews, or just general sentiment around those product launches. And yeah, it should be an interesting topic, but that'll be on the main channel, so you guys will be able to see that. And then we also have, well, Tim's monthly GPU pricing updates. So that'll be coming sometime next month, and that should be very interesting to see where those two products end up landing in about a month from now. So yeah, make sure you're subscribed for all of that. And of course, if you do have the chance, if you do have the honor of grabbing an RTX 3050 at the MSRP, I feel there'll be very few people that are able to do that. But if you are, definitely go for it. I think it's well worth jumping on that one. And really, if you can get it for any price below $400, I think for those of you who've been holding out, it's really, really worth grabbing at that price. But as I said, it'll be interesting to see where it does settle in, and we'll be covering that shortly. But yeah, like, subscribe, do all that stuff. And if you'd like to become a Hardware Unboxed community member and get some access to some pretty cool stuff, such as our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, which again, Tim and I will be doing one of those shortly for the Floatplane and Patreon members, behind the scenes content and Q&As, then yeah, check us out. Floatplane, Patreon, links are in the video description. But if not, that is perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve, and I'll see you again next time.